What's up, guys? This is Magnum Opus with part 3 of the Magnum first-person shooter tutorial. In this part of the tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to texture the M4 carbine model that we made in part 1 and unwrapped in part 2. So if you haven't seen those, check them out first in order for any of this to make sense. Before we get started, let's take a look at how these materials are made. It's done in parts, just like always. We did these all as separate parts. I'll show you the different textures that make up the material. So here's the barrel untextured, just the normal material. That's what we started out with since the previous tutorial. Then we have a color map. And if you're using a computer that doesn't support GLSL, this is what you're going to be limited to, just the color map. If you do have GLSL, then you'll be able to add a normal map. And normal maps are awesome because it lets you give the illusion of 3D on a two-dimensional surface. It changes how light is reflected off of the material. So that lets us define these sort of bumps and ridges on the material, even though it's really just a flat plane. And then we have the specular map, which changes how much light is reflected off of the material. And that lets us create the illusion of depth here. As you can see, only the tops of the rails reflect light. The other ones are black on the specular map, and that makes it not reflect light. And it gives the illusion of empty space. The same is done for these holes. And then the last texture on here is what I call a dirt map. It's just a repeating difference cloud image that I made in GIMP. And that makes the gun look a little more grimy. Together it gives a pretty realistic feel. Let's see. You want to look at the different materials that make up the gun. So of course the main receiver is made of magnesium on the actual gun. And so that's sort of a matte metallic look. Whereas the grip and the stock and the front hand grip, those are a slightly different material. It's a little bit more matte. It's like nylon, I think. I'm not really too sure about that. And just by changing different colors on the color map and the specular map, you can get these different material qualities. So for example, this little piece here in the stock, it's like stainless steel or aluminum or some sort of shiny metal that's been painted black. And the way we got that look is by making it black on the color map and white on the specular map. And that makes it black, but shiny black, essentially. So of course a lot of the detail that we didn't put into the model is now put into the texture, and so it's still on the final game object and it looks pretty damn good, I have to say. Yeah, so you got to remember it's got to look good from every angle, even like the inside of this magazine, which you are going to see during a reload animation. So you want to put that all in there. Oh, the reason I added this camera here is just to look at the gun from how you're going to see it in the game, which is going to be from this first-person perspective. And I've animated the camera so you can see the view aiming down the sights. And so we want to make sure everything looks right from those two views particularly, because that's where you're always going to be seeing the gun in the game. Alright, now before we get started, I'm going to make a new blend file here, and I'm going to show you guys how to make and use a normal map real quick, because in the actual process I go through it real fast. It's probably too fast for you to see it. And I've gone through this already in another tutorial. It's my texture tutorial on creating tile surface texture. So you can check that out. It's on Blender 2.49b. but for Blender 2.57, I'll show it to you guys right here. So I'm just going to make a normal map of the Suzanne object. Make it smooth. We're just going to render this image, but we're going to make a special material for it so that it's going to act as a normal map later on when we apply it as a game texture. Okay, I'm going to give this a square resolution. Go 512 by 512. Images, you should always make them factors of 2, and that's because they're stored as bits, which is in a factor of 2. So the main image sizes you want to be working with for game objects are like 128 by 128, 256 by 256, 512 by 512, and then the biggest textures that you ever want to have are 1024 by 1024. Alright, so let's make the normal material for this. Add a new material, make the diffuse color black, and set it to shadeless. Okay, that's important. If you mess anything up, rewind this and try it again, because all of this stuff has to be exact in order for the material to come out right, and therefore in order for the normal map to work correctly. So we're going to add 3 textures to this. I'll go ahead and title these. It's going to be red, green, and blue. These are all going to be blend textures. Okay, so select the first one, the red, go into mapping coordinates, and we're going to set it to normal. And then all of these mapping directions, change them all to X. In Blender 2.49, they were little squares that you would select. Now it's this drop-down menu. So those all need to be X for the red one. Leave blend on mix and change the color to totally red, which is 100 in RGB values. Okay, for the next texture, the green one, again change the mapping coordinates to normal. This time we're going to make all of them Y, because green is going to be mapped to the Y direction. Change blend from mix to add on this one, and that's important. It's not going to work if you don't do that. And change the color to green, which is 010 for RGB. And the last one for the blue, again, normal. This time it's going to be Z. Set blend to add and make it blue, or 001. And now this is what your material should look like. It's sort of a purple color. And now how the normal material works is it defines directions as the RGB values. So later on, when you put it in the game as a texture, the computer takes those RGB values and translates that into a normal direction to bounce light off of. So we're going to apply the same texture to that plane. And now you don't need any lights or anything because it's set to shadeless. When you render the image, you'll get something like that. And so we'll just save this real quick. Now I'll make a new blend again. We want to change this from render to Blender game. just add a quick plane. So now that we've rendered the normal map, now we're going to apply it as a game texture. We need a lamp somewhere in here to light it, because the whole point of a normal map is that it redirects light. Set this to textured mode. Shading needs to be in GLSL in order for this to work. If your graphics card doesn't support GLSL, you can't do this. Alright, we'll make a new material. It doesn't really matter what the color is. Make it pink, I guess. Give it a new texture. This is going to be an image. Title it normal. Load that image we just saved. And the mapping doesn't really matter in this case. We'll just leave it as is. But you need to go in here to image sampling, and you need to select normal map. Don't forget to do this. That's going to make sure that it calculates the normals correctly. Okay, so then under influence, turn off color, and instead under geometry over here, turn on normal. And so as you can see, now we have the normal map applied. And so even though this is a flat plane, it reacts to the light as if it's a 3D object. Now this looks fine when you're viewing it from straight on. It looks like it should, but as you increase the angle, the illusion of 3D sort of goes away. So you want to keep that in mind. So this is really handy for features like making a rough texture or something. It looks nice on mechanical models like the M4 that we made. For a lot of those small details that are too small and too poly intensive to put in as part of the model, but you still sort of need it in there, and the normal map allows you to do that without adding any more polygons to the mesh. Okay, so this is a little longer than I had anticipated. It might need to be in several parts on YouTube, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I do for each part on the gun is create a new scene to make the texture in. First we're going to do the carrying handle and rear sight, so load up that screenshot that we took of the unwrapped carrying handle and add a camera, make it a square resolution, and set it to orthographic. Make the orthographic scale 2, that way it lines up the plane exactly. Now normally I'd be making textures like this in a photo editing program like GIMP or Photoshop, but since this is a Blender tutorial, we're going to make it all in Blender. Except for the only thing I do in GIMP is text, and I'll do that later. You can use pretty much anything, just add text in there. Blender kind of sucks for that. The general theory behind my method of making textures in Blender is, since Blender is a three-dimensional modeling program and the images we're making are two-dimensional, you're actually losing one of the dimensions there. And you can use that to your advantage because everything doesn't have to look right from every direction in this model that we're doing. It just has to look good from top down, where we're going to be rendering the image from. So you'll see I'm going to have like little models and pieces all over the place, which is fine. Keeping them separate actually makes it a lot easier to do. And the reason we're making actual models like this is because we're going to just change these objects, or change the material on these objects to generate the different types of maps. It's going to be the color map, the normal map, and the specular map. So watching this, you should get a pretty good idea of how to create different types of textures and different material looks based on how I do these different models and materials in this image. So you can see, like, for the rough edge of the screw that sort of like provides grip, just make like a zigzag pattern. And I just repeat that all over the model for different parts that have that. And like I said, everything in the Z direction really does not matter as long as everything lines up from the top-down perspective. And this doesn't have to be low poly models because we're not using any of these models in the game. It's just going to be for the rendered image. So for once, you don't have to worry about poly count, which is always a good thing. So this is your opportunity to go in and add as much detail as you possibly can, because this is going to be what really makes your game object either look realistic or not. So all the detail that we missed in the model, we're going back and doing now. And again, remember that a lot of these objects are not symmetrical, meaning both sides are not exactly the same looking. And that's something to keep in mind. Even though, I guess technically in a first-person shooter it doesn't really matter since you're only going to be viewing the gun from the left side. A general rule that I try to follow is that the model you make, along with its textures, the object altogether should look like it would work if it was a real object. So all the mechanical pieces should be there and everything should be lined up correctly. Like you can see on this carrying handle, on one side it has the screws that screw onto the rails on top of the gun. And on the other side there's these two plastic pieces that sort of fit in through the rails to hold it in place, and that's what the screws hold down. So those all need to be lined up correctly. And of course I didn't put those pieces in as the model, it's just going in as the texture. A lot of times I exaggerate stuff along the z-axis, like with those ridges I made them like overpronounced. And that's for when we do the normal map. It's gonna make it stand out more. So here's how I do screws. It's a pretty handy method. It's making that cross shape and then extruding it a little bit and just moving it up on the z-axis. And then you can put whatever shape you want underneath. And of course, it doesn't look like a screw on this model, but once we render the normal map and apply it to the game object, it's going to look like a screw. And remember, if you forget what some of the parts are on the unwrapped image, that's why we have this as a separate scene. So you can always go back to your main scene and take a look at the parts that you've unwrapped and see which parts are which in the image. Okay, so now we start adding materials because we're going to create the color map first. Now every one of these materials needs to be shadeless, because obviously it doesn't need to be shaded in this image because it's going to receive lighting in-game. So these are all going to be solid colors. So remember, this is what it looks like from the top-down view. If you were to turn the view sideways, it wouldn't look like anything really, because these are all separate objects that are on different vertical layers. But as long as they all line up and it looks good as a two-dimensional image, that's all we care about. So save the color map once it's rendered. We'll go back to the scene that contains our model, add some lighting so we can see the carrying handle real well. And it's already unwrapped from the previous part of the tutorial. So we'll make a new material, add a new texture, and load the color map image that we just made. The mapping coordinates need to be on UV in order to use the UV unwrap that we already made. And now we have the color map mapped to the object. So now go back to the scene that contains the texture image. And here I'm creating that normal material that I showed you how to do on the very beginning. So go back and watch that part again if you don't remember or you don't already have the normal material made and saved. Because we're going to be reusing that material for all of these objects. And every single object in the scene needs to have the normal material applied. So now when we render the image again, we have a normal map, and we'll save that. And go back to the game object, add a new texture, load the normal map image, use UV coordinates. Remember to go under image sampling and select normal map, and then turn off color and turn on normal. So that's what the normal map looks like. So all of the third dimensional stuff that we did on that texture model, it really shows up here, like the screw heads and stuff. And remember, the most important views that it needs to look good from is from behind it. So I keep checking that a lot to make sure it looks good from that view. It's not enough to just look okay from the side. Okay, so now the last one we're going to do is a specular map. And a specular map I haven't really explained yet. What it is it's on a grayscale. And anything that's white on the specular map will come out shiny on the object, and anything black won't reflect any light at all. And any gray shade that's in between will reflect different amounts of light. So you can see some of the parts that I want to be shiny and reflective, I make those white on the specular map. And then like the spaces between the rail, I don't want that to reflect light to make it look like it's sort of in the shadows there. And so I make that totally black on the specular map. So now when we apply that, it's going to change how much light is reflected from different parts. And that's going to give the illusion that it's made up of multiple materials. And this is just the difference cloud image that I'm using as a dirt map. So when you apply the specular map, you need to turn off color and turn on specularity amount and specular color. You can also play around with hardness. And for specularity, I usually set the blend to multiply, and that way I can put in multiple specularity maps and they don't totally wash out the other ones. And again, play around with all of the different color values and stuff to try to get the effect you want. It just takes some time messing around with it in order to figure out what everything does. Okay, so the dirt map was also applied as a specular map and set to multiply. So that way it also changes how much light is reflected. And that gives it that sort of dirty, used feeling. That's it for the carrying handle. So the rest of these parts are done exactly the same. I'll just let you guys watch it. Alright, that wraps up the section on making weapons for the Blender game engine. The next part of the tutorial is going to be the first one to cover gameplay. So remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.